Everything that I do and everything that I focus on is about helping people to influence themselves more effectively, as well as influencing others more effectively too. And in this episode of the Changing Minds podcast, I'm going to do a deep dive into the field of persuasion. This is your ability to be able to influence other people in such a way that you're able to change their attitudes and behaviors. In this episode, we're going to be exploring some of the most important and most useful techniques that will help you to be better at persuading anyone. This one is going to be one of the most useful episodes you could ever watch. Let's get going. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Changing Minds podcast. I'm Owen Fitzpatrick, and today we are going to talk about one of my favorite topics in the world, persuasion. Persuasion is the art or science of changing someone's attitude or behavior. And it's a form of influence, although it's not the only form of influence, of course, but it is a form of influence. And sometimes it gets a bit of a bad rap. And so what we're going to do is we're going to unpack what persuasion is, what it isn't. We'll explore some of the different notions and some of the ideas that are mentioned alongside it. And then we'll start to look at what I believe to be one of the most useful models or frameworks or way of thinking about persuasion. It's an addition to the wonderful approach or the wonderful framework given to us more than 2,000 years ago from Aristotle. I've added an element to it and I've dove into it in a slightly different way. And I want to share that with you today on this episode. And so first of all, let's look at what persuasion is and what it isn't. So often people look at persuasion and they immediately get the alarm bells and they think to themselves, oh, persuasion, oh, that's very manipulative. But the reality is we're always persuading people. Every time you get someone to say yes to you, when they weren't necessarily going to say yes. Or every time someone says no to you and you've tried to succeed at getting them to say yes, you've been involved in persuasion. And so not all persuasion is created equal. If you, for instance, use manipulation, I create a distinction between manipulation and persuasion. If you ethically persuade somebody, what you're doing is you're trying to figure out what is it that they want, what is it that you want, and how can you connect the dots. So you're trying to find a way to connect what you're trying to get them to do with what they want, right? What is important for them. And that could be something tangible or even some sort of intangible feeling that they want at this moment in time. So for instance, you want to be able to sell them something. Can you connect whatever it is that you want them to buy with something that they want, with a feeling that they want, with an experience that they want? If you can, then you will be able to effectively persuade them. Manipulation, on the other hand, is not caring about what the other person wants and really just focusing on, can you get them to do what you want them to do? And the other element as well that adds into the mix here is manipulation relies on you being able to use deception. So you're going to deceive them. You're going to lie to them. You're going to say whatever you need to say or do whatever you need to do in order to get them to do the action that you want them to or take the action that you want them to take. And that's, once again, different to persuasion or ethical persuasion, where we're looking to make sure that we're being above board. We're being legit with people. We're being real with people. We're being honest with people. And we're not deceiving them in any way, shape, or form. So it's important to recognize that while people sometimes think that persuasion is manipulative, the reality is persuasion is part of the course. We're doing it anyway. And those who master persuasion are going to have a much better likelihood to be a lot more successful as a result. We need to be able to be better at communicating as effectively as we can. So with that in mind, it's also important for us to recognize concepts that have come from the areas like behavioral economics, such as nudging. Nudging is helping people change behavior by organizing the environment in subtle ways to steer them or nudge them towards a new behavior. Once again, that's not necessarily persuasion, because while it might help them to change their behavior, you're not changing their mind about something, and you're not immediately changing the way they're acting as a result of your argument, either emotional or logical argument. Instead, you're affecting their behavior by organizing the environment around in a new way. So once again, it's a subtle distinction, but it's important to recognize it's not the same in terms of nudging. Now, we then need to ask the question, well, why is persuasion hard in the first place? Like, why is it hard for us to be persuaded? And when we look at that, we realize that we started off as babies. And as babies, our first words were no. So we immediately have this concept in psychology known as reactance, which basically means that our desire to be able to maintain autonomy over our actions, in other words, our desire to be able to make sure that no one manipulates us, means that we have this natural tendency to immediately reject whenever we feel that control is being taken away from us. So you see a baby, you're trying to force feed them, you're trying to get them to eat their vegetables, and they go, no, I don't want it. Whereas if you take the vegetables away, they're all of a sudden, they're like, oh, I want my vegetables. Why? because you've taken away the reactance. You've made it so that now they've nothing to react to. So it's important to recognize that even though we laugh and go, oh, aren't we funny when we're babies? That's exactly as we are as adults as well, right? We still have reactance still happens as adults as well. And alongside this, we also have a concept called confirmation bias, which is we look for evidence to prove our conclusions are true, and we dismiss evidence that contradicts them. So again, when you start to think through what that actually looks like or what that actually means, here's what it looks at. The truth of the matter is that we like to feel right. Why do we like to feel right? Well, back in the hunter-gatherer days, in order for us to survive, we need to make the right decision. So when we make the right decision, we get rewarded. Our brain releases a chemical called dopamine, which is the molecule of motivation, which is to do with anticipation and reward. So the more that we do something that our brain wants us to do, it gives us dopamine and it makes us more likely to replicate the behavior. So in other words, we get something right, our brain makes us feel good. So when we feel right, our brain is giving us that motivation. The problem is that we get motivated or we get the positive chemical in our brain whenever we feel right, not necessarily when we are right. So it's the feeling that drives the particular chemical reaction. And in this context, what that means is we become addicted to becoming right. Now, if you're addicted to becoming right, you want to be right all the time. And therefore, if you get an idea of some sort in your head and you think, okay, A is correct, and somebody comes along and says, well, actually, let me tell you why B is correct, you're already thinking to yourself, listen, bro, I know you think B is correct, and that's fine, but I want to be right, and I want A to be right. And therefore, because I want A to be right, A is going to be right. Yeah, but what about this and this? Yeah, whatever. And I'm going to interpret everything you say and find a way to be able to justify why all of that stuff you say, why we don't need to pay attention to it. And then I think to myself, as I defend my belief, what are all the reasons as to why I'm right and you're wrong? And it's a particularly powerful phenomenon, particularly in the days we have it today. Nowadays, so often what happens is we decide that we're going to ascribe to a certain point of view, a certain belief, a certain behavior, because the social group that we're in with tends to ascribe to that behavior, tends to vote for that person, tends to support that particular policy. And so we do it as well. But the problem is we haven't reasoned to that. It's not like we sat down going, I wonder what would be the best policy. Let me do all my research. Let me use my brain power to be able to figure out what the best thing to do is. Have you ever sat down and voted for a candidate by doing your research on every single candidate, all of their philosophies and policies and thoughts and ideas, and then made a judicious decision based upon all the available evidence that you've organized in a full way? Is that how you vote? My guess is if you're like 99.999% of people, it's not. Now you might say, oh, no, I do my research. I don't know about you. Tell me, how much research do you do? Do you really spend hours poring over the candidate's perspectives or point of view? Well, it might be a lot simpler than that. They might have certain policies that are obvious. But do we know that they're obvious? Have we really investigated what they've actually said they're going to do? Have we explored the way in which they've used language? Have we understood the difference between what they've said versus what their opposition has said that they've said? See, all of this really speaks to this natural tendency we have to be able to formulate stories in our head. We tell ourselves stories about what people are saying. And why this matters from a persuasion point of view is because we can hold on to and build in our own mind this sort of ecosystem that reinforces the way we think about this. Online, we call these echo chambers, where we find ourselves just surrounded by our own opinions. So you go online and let's say you're on you support policy A, and you go, oh yeah, so policy A, and you join a Facebook group which says policy A is the best, and everyone around there is going, yeah, policy A is the best, policy B is for losers, policy B is so stupid, policy B, they're lying to you, policy B, they're full of disinformation, policy B, you can't trust them, policy B, fake news, policy A is the truth, policy A is the way, policy A is the best. And so very soon what happens is you use your rational brain to kick in. You engage in rationalizing. And that's the problem, is that this notion of logic and rationale and our ability to reason, which is what we always thought that we use to be able to figure out what's true, right? We learned from things like Aristotle and all the philosophers and whatnot, that the way in which we figure out what's going on and the way we figure things out in science is we reason. We use our reasoning to figure out what's actually happening. So the biggest mistake we make is we assume that what we're doing with our logic and reasoning skills most of the time is figuring out what's true. And actually, it's figuring out how to make sure that we prove what we want to be true is true. In other words, Robert Heinlein, I think his name is a famous science fiction author. He said, humans are not rational creatures. We're rationalizing creatures. I just love that one-liner because I think it epitomizes the most important message here, which is that we look to rationalize our ideas or thoughts. We want to feel right. Therefore, we use logic and reason, which should be what we use to figure out what's going on, should be what we use to figure out who to vote for, should be what we use to figure out where to go, what to buy, what to do, who to marry. We should be using our logic to do that. But instead, all we do is find ways to rationalize the decisions that we unconsciously already make or our feelings make for us, right? What's imperative to understand is this is something we need to own up to, and this is something that we need to recognize is going on, because the reason we struggle with being able to persuade people is because we are trying to persuade them with logic. We're trying to persuade them with the most logical argument, with the most amount of evidence. And the facts are that evidence is not enough. Being right is not enough. Coming to the table, having all stacked the deck with all the evidence, all it does is make people sometimes even more stubborn, more likely to react negatively to you. So it's imperative that we don't fall into this trap of assuming that we are right and we know we're right and the other person's definitely wrong. Because as soon as we do that, we fail to keep that element of curiosity alive. If you look at one of the best people at persuading, and also as we talked about in past episode, one of the worst, Socrates, he was wonderful one-to-one, but in a group, when he was trying to convince people not to sentence him to death, he was pretty awful. But the reason he was so good in one-to-one was because he used questions, because he opened up people's perception by getting them to realize that actually they didn't know as much as they thought. So the way he was able to succeed was because he overrode this reactance tendency. He overrode the confirmation bias because he asked questions and got the other person to start to think to himself and explore, maybe, just maybe, I'm making a mistake here. By asking, how did you learn that? Or how did you come to that conclusion? The person had to then go into their own logic and realize that they'd been rationalizing, realize that actually they did not have as much security in their belief as they first thought. And it's imperative for us to realize this if we want to be more persuasive. We need to understand that if we are to be more persuasive, it's not just about logically influencing people. It's about emotionally changing the way they feel. And obviously, again, Aristotle talked about this. He talked about ethos, logos, and pathos. And that is, ethos is the appeal of the character, logos is the logical appeal of your argument, and then pathos is your emotional appeal. But there's also what I believe is one of the most important elements of the 20th century or so, which is the study of the people. So you have the source of persuasion, which is the ethos, the character. That's the communicator, the speaker. You have the message, and the message is communicated in terms of logic and emotion, the logos and the pathos. But there's a fourth quality here that I want to call out, and that's the audience. And I like to call that the demos, right? And the demos is the audience themselves, the recipients of the message. And we learn so much over the course of the last 100 years about how people think, why people think what they think, why they believe what they believe. We've done all sorts of research in terms of neuroscience research that lets us know what's going on in the brain of a person when they experience a persuasive attempt. We know what happens and what parts of the brain light up whenever they're watching a story. We've learned so much, not just from neuroscience, but also from psychology, from interviewing them, from exploring what matters most, from studying the key words a person uses and the way in which a person talks about the particular things that we're speaking to them about. So we know a massive amount about why people make the decisions they do. Not to mention the behavioral economics research, which looks at why we're not always logical in the decisions that we make. And so there's a number of different things that make us persuaded. There's, first of all, our cognitive biases. And this is really when we talk about the demos, when we talk about the people, there's the biases that they have, the confirmation bias, the overconfidence bias, what we call loss aversion, where we feel worse about what we have to lose than we feel positive about what we might gain. There's all of these different biases that are at play whenever we make decisions. And if we want to be more persuasive, then our ability to be able to figure out how to leverage or use or understand these biases can help us to be able to become a lot more persuasive and a lot more impactful in the way in which we deliver messages. So cognitive biases is one of the factors that we need to master. We also need to recognize the importance of obviously logic, as we talked about, the ability to be able to put forward a strong argument, use whether deductive or inductive logic or any of the other forms of logical reasoning to be able to put across the message and the requisite amount of evidence that we can put forward to put forward a convincing argument. We also need to be able to recognize the expectations of the other person. So recognize where they are. So if I'm trying to influence an audience, I want to understand what are they already thinking so I can map what they're thinking and what their expectations are with regards to where I wanted them to go. So it doesn't matter how persuasive a person you are, if you've got the ethos sorted, if you've got a great logical argument, and if you're well skilled in changing the way they feel, if you don't know what they're thinking and feeling before you start to work, you're going to struggle. Because not all people and not all audiences are on the same level. So if I'm trying to influence you or persuade you in some way, well, quite frankly, you might be in a very different place than me. If you're talking to someone who already buys into you and believes you, you want to be using a very different persuasion attempt than if the person doesn't believe you or is on the other side, right? They're two totally different ways, but we need to start with the person and trying to understand what is it that they believe now, what is it that they feel now, what is they're thinking now about you, about the message, and therefore, what is it that they need to hear in order for them to change their mind. When we start to think through strategic persuasion in this way, we can become a lot more powerful at it. So we've got the biases, we've got our ability to be able to use logic in a more effective way, understanding the expectations of the other person. But we also need to understand their emotions. And the emotions are, what is it that they feel? Because most of the time we build reality through what we call affective realism. Affective realism is the notion of seeing the world in the way in which we feel it's true. So our feelings tend to dictate what we focus on and how we interpret the world that we see. So if I'm trying to convince you of something, if I'm trying to persuade you of something, I first need to change the way you feel. I need to figure out how can I change the way you feel. And remember, we need to know what the person's expectations are and what they currently feel for us to be able to map over to what we want them to feel. So for me to be able to use pathos effectively, I need to first take the pulse of what you're already feeling, what you're already experiencing. Once I know that, then I can start to go, how do I change your feeling from what you're currently feeling to what I want you to feel? Whether I use storytelling, my own emotional state, rhetorical techniques or questions, or whatever tactic or technique I use, the key is I need to be able to bring you on a journey. And that's one of the reasons why stories are so powerful, is because stories allow you to transport the listener into your story, called narrative transportation, where you bring them into the story. They identify with the protagonist in the story, and therefore you bring them on the journey so you can bring them towards the emotion that you're looking for them to accomplish, regardless of how much you know about them. But the more you can make the story relevant to what their expectations are, the more powerful that will be. And then the other thing you want to be able to know is, what is the desire of the audience? What is the desire of the person that you're trying to persuade? What is it that they want? And this brings back the whole necessity of understanding the importance of ethical persuasion. How do I connect what I want you to do or think or feel to what you actually want? What you want to have, what you want to do, what you want to feel? How do I connect it with that? Now, if you take a simple example, one of the biggest reasons that people are not persuaded isn't just because someone's using logic, it's because of the way in which we're being talked to. If someone tries to persuade you, but they're very disrespectful and they're acting as if you're an idiot because you believe something different to them, it's not going to work with you. You're not going to turn around and feel good because they do that. Disrespect is one of the best ways to lose people and to ensure that you will never persuade them. But if you can respect people and make them feel respected, you can give them that. You can validate their identity as someone who you respect, as someone who's smart. It's much easier to get them to open their mind in that way as well. So we need to understand these biases, these expectations, the logical reasoning we're using, the way in which we make them feel, and indeed what they want. And sometimes what they don't want, their fears as well. And that's really what we look at when we explore this notion of the demos, the people. We also might be looking at their generation, their culture, the background, what they've experienced to date, what they know, what they don't know. The more information we can collect on the people we're trying to influence or persuade, the more successful we'll be. And then once we get that out of the way, the next step is for us to go, okay, how do we need to come across? What does our ethos need to be? How do we need to position ourselves in the mind of the other person? What are the characteristics or qualities they most need to see in us in order for them to buy into us, in order for them to believe in us? Do we need to demonstrate reliability, competence, expertise, experience, composure, charisma, confidence, likability? What is most important for them to experience us as? Then, once we've demonstrated that, once we've engaged in the behaviors and used the language that personifies those kinds of qualities, the third step will be the logos. That's making sure that we've got the logical argument structured in the most effective way. There's lots of ways to be able to use logic and use logical reasoning. As I mentioned, there's deductive logic, there's inductive logic, there's using metaphors and analogies. There's all sorts of different ways to be able to put across your messages. But we need to be able to ensure that we've got sufficient evidence, either if we're walking them through it step by step, or we're given a number of different examples as to why we're right. We need to be able to ensure we've got a clear message that we know exactly what we want them to believe. We know why we want them to believe it. We believe that we're correct, and we know exactly why we're so sure. And we also want to be able to cultivate what we call a steelman argument. This means that we've made sure that we know what is an airtight argument that can defend against any potential objection. But then we also need to know what their objections will be. What is their argument? And not just what's their weakest argument, what's their strongest argument? What's their steelman argument? Because if you can start to identify what's their steelman argument, what's the best argument they could possibly have, and you can find ways to challenge that argument, now you're going to be a lot more likely to be persuasive. But once again, we then go to the final piece, the pathos. This is the piece where we absolutely must bring it in. And it's the piece that we forget about far too often. And this is about how do we make them feel? And so all the way where we're demonstrating that we understand their argument and we have our own argument and we challenge their argument, we need to do so by maintaining the way in which they feel respected, that they feel listened to, that they feel heard, and that they feel the desired identity that they want. We want to make them feel okay about changing their mind. We want to make them feel less certain about their perspective. And so if we can focus on how do we make them feel that way, and that could be by using stories. It could be by us getting into the same feeling that we want them to feel, which is known as state contagion or emotional contagious, as emotions could be contagious. It could be by asking questions, that by answering the questions, it creates that feeling. What would it be like if you were wrong? They start to imagine themselves being wrong, which in turn makes them start to feel a sense of doubt, for instance. Right? All of these are examples or ways to be able to cultivate the feeling, or even just asking them questions and getting them to start to recognize that what they thought was very well thought out might not actually be. What you're doing is making them feel the ownership and feel the autonomy and reducing the resistance that allows them the permission to be able to change their own mind. This is how persuasion works. And if you can get really skilled at being able to study the people, the demos, you can get really good at positioning yourself with the right kind of ethos. You can become an expert at logos, and most important of all, you can master the art of pathos. You are going to be so much more effective, whether you're a leader, whether you're in sales, whether you're in marketing, whether you're a parent, whether you're trying to get a partner and you're going on a date, whatever the context of your life is. Persuasion is one of the most useful tools. And again, you want to always do it from the place of and the perspective of being ethical and being above board. But in this day's world, where we live in a world of polarization, where we live in a world where it's very easy for us to be influenced and persuaded, and whoever is the most persuasive tends to be the most successful, you can't afford not to become great at this. To me, the most important skill that you can ever possibly learn is the ability to master persuasion. And part of that is persuading yourself, overcoming what I call inner propaganda. But a big part of it is also about mastering the art of persuading others too. There's an art to it, there's a science to it. And I really hope that you found this useful. I hope that the ideas and skills that I've shared with you today, they're only scratching the surface, of course, but they give you and provide you with a means to become more effective, more skilled at being able to get people to say yes, at helping people to change their minds. For now, please, I hope I've persuaded you to subscribe to the channel. And I hope that you found a lot of useful ideas here. But I hope that you are able to use them to be able to continue to improve the way in which you interact, the way you communicate, and the way you influence others. For now, take care, be well. May the forces always be with you. And talk to you soon. Bye for now.